Well, candidly, it's quite a breathless opportunity to follow the session that we just had in session 2. So we're going to shift gears rather amazingly as we go into the third section with a strange topic. It may sound a little different from the other ones we've talked about. I want to raise a question that it's my view that there's probably less than 1 in 100 Bible students have any idea who the Edomites are. And I was quite puzzled as I traveled with more and more rabbis that I hold the scholarship very high of. I discovered they have some strange views that I needed to understand. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is known as the Olam Ibah, the everlasting hatred. What on earth is that all about? It lurks behind a great deal of biblical history. It also lurks behind some of the primary dynamics of current events today. And so we're going to talk. It's a continuing enigma. The everlasting hatred. When did that start? It started in the womb before they were born. And this continues to drive events throughout our world today. The everlasting hatred. What on earth is that all about? And I submit to you, there are very few that really understand it. The judgment against this protagonist is mentioned in more Old Testament books than it is against any other foreign nation. All through the Scripture, we see there's judgment against various nations. Here is one that exceeds them all. What on earth is this all about? And it's my suggestion that very few observers can identify its proponents in their contemporary forms. That's what we want to get a perspective of here. Let's go to Genesis 25, where it speaks, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Paddan, the sister to Laban the Syrian. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And so, as the children struggled together within her, she had twins, in other words, she said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, get this, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Really? When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Okay? The first came out red. Remember that. Red, because it becomes very significant. The first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel. And his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. And the boys grew. And Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. And Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau, because he did eat of his venison. But Rebekah loved Jacob. You all know the story, but you may not realize its echoes through history. Esau. And there are fascinating word plays behind this first twin. The name Esau has a loose connection with the word Seir, which is an early name for Edom to the southeast of the Dead Sea, where Esau later lived. So Seir and Esau are related linguistically. The Hebrew word for red, admoni, is related to the word Edom, and the word hairy is similar to the word Seir. So these words there's a little word play going on with these things. These words are carefully chosen to portray in the nature of Edom and the later arch-rival, if you will, of Israel. Now Jacob also, the word Yaakov means may he God protect, but it's very close to the word agib, which is heel, and it's also very close to a Hebrew word which means deceitful, sly, or insidious. So when you use the word Yaakov, It can echo heel catching, which is what literally happened, and also deceitful, sly, insidious. And the way I usually summarize, would you buy a used car from Jacob? Probably not, you see. Thus he's the one who grabs the heel, one who trips up. That's really what Jacob means, interestingly enough. And Paul makes a thing of that. If God can justify Jacob, he can justify any of us. In Romans 9, Paul points out, he says, for the children not yet being born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth. It was said unto her, the elder shall serve the younger. As is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. What a strange passage by Paul on this whole thing. Getting back to Genesis 25, and Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field and was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, that same red pottage. There's that red again, the red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. See, the concept of red and Edom get linked to Esau, you see, for a lot of different reasons. And Jacob said, sell me this day thy birthright. Wow. Esau said, behold, I'm at a point to die. What profit shall this birthright do to me? Jacob said, swear to me this day. And he sware unto him. And he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Trivial to him, profoundly significant to God. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus, key words, Esau despised his birthright. Heavy stuff. He despised his birthright. I could informally call that the unpardonable sin. This leads to the olam haba, the everlasting hatred. I want you to realize that this covenant we're talking about is unique, not just to them, it's unique to the planet Earth. It's exclusive to humans and universally unprecedented. That's something that's going to come out very clearly in subsequent sessions. The coveted covenant, Sarah versus Hagar, Isaac versus Ishmael, Jacob versus Esau. This echoes through the scripture. And these are in your notes so you can go back and do some work here. It may surprise you to think this through. The most compelling argument for the uniqueness of terrestrial life on the planet Earth is the incarnation of the Creator himself, who became an everlasting member of the human race. You and I take that for granted from a biblical point of view. By the way, that cuts through a huge amount of scientific conjecture about life in other planets and all that going on. The field of astrobiology has a problem. Science is the study of evidence, and astrobiology has no evidence. Try as they search, there's no evidence of life outside the planet Earth. Don't confuse wishful thinking from evidence. Astrobiology has nothing to study because there's no evidence. And yet it goes on and on and on, and leading to all kinds of misguided effort. And we'll talk more about that in the coming sessions. But let's go on here. The bypass of the firstborn is a theme all through the Bible. Seth over Cain, Shem over Japheth, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Judah and Joseph for different reasons over Reuben, Moses over Aaron, and David, of course, over all his brothers. Is God making a point here? Yes, it's called election. Yes, there are rules, but God chooses to deviate anytime he likes. And there's a lesson behind all this. When we talk about the descendants of Abraham, most of us, have you done your study? Obviously, you know Isaac, Ishmael, and under Hagar, and under Keturah, there's a whole other group. And under Isaac, of course, he has here in the twins, the Esau and Jacob, right? What you need to understand is that Esau deliberately, motivated to offend his parents, did something very strange. He took a wife from Ishmael, the Ishmaelites. He did that on purpose to offend his parents, which means, in effect, that's in Genesis 26, is that the descendants of Esau are distinct from the other descendants of Abraham. Because under Abraham you got Isaac and Jacob, and of course we study that in great depth. What you need to realize, this other collection of people, call them Ishmaelites or the other sons of Keturah, we collectively, out of ignorance, call them Arabs. That's not quite price, but the press uses that term indiscriminately. But that's what we're talking about. And they did not keep genealogical records. The idea of separation and descendancy was not crisply required, as it was in the descendants of Jacob and so forth. So we need to understand. Edom, the name derives from Esau the Red in Genesis 25. It's the name of the land occupied by Esau's descendants, formerly called the land of Seir. It stretched from the Wadi Zered and the Gulf of Aqaba, extending to both sides of the Arabah, the Great Depression connecting the Dead Sea to the Red Sea, if you will. Okay? Esau had already occupied Edom when Jacob returned from Haran, if you're following the history of Abraham. You want to really understand that history. But there was a time, you may recall, that Israel, in their wanderings under Moses, they wanted to take a shortcut. Edom refused to give Israel passage by the way of the King's Highway, in Numbers 20 and so forth. When the king of Edom refused to allow the children of Israel to pass through his land on their way to Canaan, they detoured around the country because of his show of force and because God ordered them to do so rather than wage war. Okay, so the tensions are very real. We could spend a lot of time, but I'll just leave quick notes in your notes so you can just. Israel was forbidden to abhor his Edomite brother. Balaam had predicted the conquest of Edom in Numbers 24. Joshua was allocated the territory of Judah up to the borders of Edom, but did not encroach on their fields. 2 centuries later, King Saul was fighting the Edomites. David finally conquers Edom and put garrisons throughout the land. Those are all verses you can check out, double back on all of this. In Jehoshaphat's time, the Edomites joined the Ammonites and Moabites in a raid to Judah, but the allies fell fighting one to another. Under Jehoram, Edom rebelled but could not reduce them to subjection. Edom had a respite of some 40 years then, and on it goes on. There's more fighting and going on, and you can go unscramble that on your own studies because I want to keep moving here. So we get to a very key point in history we want to focus on, the destruction of Jerusalem. You all remember how the Babylonians, God used them as form of judgment. 586 BC is the time, and the place is Jerusalem. The event is the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonian armies. I want you to visualize this in your mind. We see the angry soldiers as they wreck the walls. They slay the people, and they burn the city. These are the Babylonians destroying Jerusalem. You got the picture in your mind. But you see something else going on. We see a group of neighboring citizens as they stand on the other side and encourage the Babylonians to ruin the city. Raise it, they are calling. Dash their little children against the stones and wipe out the Jews. That's what's being screamed by the Edomites. They're supposed to be in the same family. No. They are the arch enemy of Israel. When you get to Psalm 137, there's a very strange passage you won't understand unless you understand what was going on back in 586. Because in the psalmist it says, "Remember, O Lord, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, even to the foundation thereof. O daughter of Babylon, who art thou to be destroyed, happy shall be he that rewardeth thee as thou hast served us. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones." When you read that psalm without the background, you wonder, what on earth is that all about? No, they're echoing the kind of insults that were yelled at them during the Babylonian captivity. Raise it. That means make bare and so on. So I want to point out how most of us are victims of the erroneous maps in the back of your Bible. In the back of your Bible, you probably have a map, something like I'm showing you on the screen here, where we've got Jerusalem in the center and Hebron a little to the south and Gaza on the coast, the Negev, the south, well in the south, a place called Petra that's just slightly south and slightly east of the Dead Sea. And you probably have then Bashan up in the north, the Golan as we would call it. A little below that are the Amorites, a little below that a place called Moab, and a little place below that called Edom. Most of us get the concept of Edom from those little maps because we're not paying attention to history. Because east of there is a group of the Nabateans. The Nabateans are quite strong, and they're driving westward. And they forced the Edomites to move westwards. Here we always see Edom visualized as southeast of the Dead Sea, only for a while, because they have to migrate to southwest of the Dead Sea. And so there's a place called Idumea, which is another way of saying the country of Edom. They migrated out of Arabia into Edom and drove the Edomites westward, that is, the Nabateans did. And directly west of Edom were the established routes of passage. Land was historically more prosperous and resourceful than the land of Edom, unfertile deserts and jagged mountains. The land bore a family association, Esau with Jacob. Land was being vacated to the Jews being exported into captivities. Let me show you some on the map. See, as what goes on, the Nabateans are driving the Edomites to the area southwest of the Dead Sea. And as time is going on, and they set up a country in which their headquarters is Hebron, south of Jerusalem. Now get the picture as the Babylonians are taking the southern kingdom, the Jerusalem, into captivity. The people that are prospering by that are the Edomites. They're cheering the Babylonians on, and as they take the captives into captivity into Babylon, they get to move into that real estate. They take over. It's a good deal for the Edomites. You get the picture here. Okay? And if you look at the early Roman maps, first century or so, you'll see a country called Idumea. It doesn't show up on most maps, but it was there for a while. Okay? The emergency here. And so as the Babylonian the Edomites seized the Amalekite territory, so Idumea came to mean the region between the Arabah and the Mediterranean. Hebron's about 19 miles south of Jerusalem. That was the new frontier. And now then what happens, of course, finally Hebron remains under Edomite control until Judaeus Maccabeus. We all know about the Maccabean revolt, when the Jews were able by then to regain their independence. They actually threw off the yoke of the Greek Empire under Judaeus Maccabeus. And they retook the city of Jerusalem, under Jewish control in about 164 BC. Most of us are somewhat familiar with that, probably. 38 years later, they had to be reconquered by the Jewish army under the prince and high priest John Hyrcanus. He was one of the big leaders in the Maccabean revolt. But here's a piece of history most people don't realize. When the Jews regained control of the region, it was populated with Edomites. They forced the Edomites to become Jews, in the same sense that we've seen other abuse through history, but the other way around, so to speak. We're not talking about Jews being forced to be Christians, as happens later, in Spanish history. Here, the Idumeans were forced to either die or be proselytized into Judaism. So you understand what's happening here. In the population of the Hasmoneans, there are people who are forced to pretend they're Jews. Get the picture? So that in 47 BC, when Julius Caesar promoted Idumean Antipater as procurator over Judea and Samaria and Galilee, Julius Caesar assumed that an Idumean is a near Jew. He's like one of them. See, to the Roman mind, it's a family squabble. Whether you're Jew or Idumean, that's a family squabble. They felt by appointing an Idumean, that was the next best thing to have that's really Jewish. Can you understand the confusion here? Okay? By 37 BC, the Romans named Herod, the son of Antipater, as king over Israel. They thought they're putting a Jew in charge of Israel. Doesn't that make sense? No, he was an Idumean. They weren't sensitive to the fact that he was forced to pretend he's a Jew. You with me so far? So you got Antipater, of course, and then you have the whole sequence of the Herods are Idumean. They're Edomites, not Jewish. To the Roman mind, they looked Jewish. They felt Jewish. Okay? You see, Herod's mother was an Nabatean. He was actually one of the ones that drove the out of there, okay? The Idumeans had 5 centuries of prior history in Israel by the time of the arrival of Jesus. 5 centuries of history under various Herods, okay? This is what's called the everlasting hatred, the Olam Haba. The Herods of the New Testament were not Jews. They were Edomites. One of them killed the Jewish babies at Bethlehem. Another Herod murdered John the Baptist. Another Herod killed James, the brother of John. The struggle between the Israelis and the so-called Arabs today is a continuation of the same battle. It started back in Genesis 25. It started in the womb. Now let's shift to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. By the time we get to 70 AD, there are civil turmoil among the Zealots, the Idumeans, and the Orthodox Jews. A lot of confusion. 20,000 Idumean infantry slaughtered many of the Orthodox Jews. Many fought with the Jews against the Romans. A lot of confusion. Many were killed, sold into slavery, or joined among the 40,000 set free by Caesar. Strange mix of going on here. And then we get faced the renaming of the land. By the time you get to this period of history, Bar Kokhba had about 200,000 men at his command and had recaptured Jerusalem and many strongholds. But Emperor Hadrian had come to the conclusion that as long as there's any Jewish presence in Jerusalem, they're never able to rule this land. So he wanted all the Jews out of there, and he wanted to rename the thing as un-Jewishly as he could. Okay? See, about 500,000 people lost their lives in that era. So Hadrian proposed to stamp out Jewish nationalism entirely. Traditions such as circumcision, the Sabbath, reading the Torah was forbidden under penalty of death. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine a Jewish family not being able to circumcise because there'd be evidence that they had violated the law and they were subject to death? Can you imagine the trauma? Now, in their choice of the Jews' worst enemy, the Romans had 2 choices. They could have named the land either one of 2 ways. They could have called it Idumea, because the Edomites were hated by the Jews, but the Romans weren't sensitive to that. They chose an alternative. They felt the most obvious enemy of Israel was the Philistines. So they named the land Philistia, in effect, which actually in the Latin is Palestine. See, the Idumeans were viewed as practitioners of Judaism, not as great an enemy as were the Philistines. There are many that appear today as Jews that are really not. If you look at up to maps of up to 135 AD, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, still displays Judea. The Romans chose to name the land Palestina. That's a Latin way of saying Philistia. Idumea disappeared from future maps in history. The Edomites, later known as Idumeans, became assimilated into what we call today the Palestinians of today. Let's start to clarify things. When you study Psalm 83, that'll surface as a major issue that you need to deal with. When you study Ezekiel 25 to 32, there are 7 nations that are judged by the Messiah when he returns. Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, and Sidon, and Egypt. What's interesting about these 7 nations detailed from Ezekiel 25 to 32, what do they all have in common? They're all Muslims. How interesting. How interesting. Now, the one of that list of 7, it's the judgment against Edom that is mentioned more in the Old Testament books than it is against any other foreign nation. And the list of references are there in your notes. You can go ahead and check them down yourself. It gets worse than this. We're just getting warmed up here. Obadiah, the entire book has to do with the judgment of Edom. Though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord. It's fascinating to discover how the eagle is portrayed in the Bible. Really? The eagle. See, Edom was a small nation, but she boasted of her achievements. And the eagle, strangely enough, has been the traditional insignia of Israel's enemies throughout history. Herod had an eagle. Rome, eagle. The Nazi Germany had the British, the Russians, and America, symbolized by the eagle. The eagle is an ensign. And we can go through all of these. Antiochus Epiphanes, the Romans, Titus Vespasian. And by the way, it's kind of interesting that Antiochus Epiphanes, a type of the Antichrist, and Titus Vespasian, a type of, they may have been linked genealogically. I can't prove it, but it would not surprise me that if we discover that there's a genetic link through these types, strangely enough. Byzantium, Russia, the Romanovs, the Franks, the Germans, and on it goes. And we find the eagle is a surprisingly consistent symbol of whoever is the enemy of Israel at the time. Did someone design that? I don't think so. And yet there it is. But is there another missing link that we might learn something from? Another missing link. There's another dimension to the Edomites today that will emerge, I believe, from careful study. I think I've told you that the Lord gave me a strange whisper one night, over a year ago. Metaphors reign where mysteries reside. What on earth? Why did he call that to my attention? And that has echoed through my studies here for more than a year or two. I also discovered, as I mixed with knowledgeable rabbis, they have a strange use of phrase that puzzled me. When we talk about globalists, these people in power that are going for a one-world government, the rabbis frequently refer to them as Edomites. And I because some of our close friends, says, where do you get that? Why do you call them Edomites? See, I was thinking of it in the biblical genetical linkage like most of us would. They use it idiomatically in a little broader way, apparently. It's a term they regard as referring to Rome or any other aspiring empire. That's the way they use that term as a metaphor. And the question is why? Well, I want to tell you a story of a guy, interesting guy. His name is Amschel Moses Bauer, okay? In 1743, a goldsmith named Amschel Moses Bauer opened a coin shop in Frankfurt, Germany. He hung over his door a sign depicting a Roman eagle on a red shield. The shop became known as the Red Shield Firm. That became his logo. Okay? Amschel Bauer had a son who turned out to be a very, very bright, resourceful young man. Meyer Amschel Bauer, at a very early age, he showed that he possessed immense intellectual ability, and his father spent much of his time teaching him everything he could about money lending, business, and the basic dynamics of finance. Okay? A few years later, after his father's death in 1755, Meyer went to work in Hanover as a clerk in a bank owned by the Oppenheimers. Meyer's superior ability was quickly recognized, and his advancement within the firm was very swift. His success allowed him the means to return to Frankfurt and to purchase the business his father had established back in 1743. You following us so far? Okay. The big red shield was still displayed over the door. So he adopts that as his symbol and changes his name to Red Shield. Now, the true significance of the red shield, his father adopted it back in from the red flag, which was the emblem of the revolutionary-minded Jews in Eastern Europe. Meyer Amschel Bauer changed his name to Rothschild. Not Rothschild, that's mispronounced by most Americans. Rothschild. That's the German word for red shield. Rothschild. At this point, the house of Rothschild became into being. And many of you know the story. Through his experience with the Oppenheimers, Meyer learned that loaning money to governments and kings was much more profitable than loaning to private individuals. Not only were the loans bigger, but they were secured by the nation's taxes. And so that led, of course, to the house of Rothschild. And he had 5 sons. Now, he has 5 sons. Amschel, Solomon, Nathan, Carl, and Yaakov. And they are all very, very bright and very well trained. Meyer spent the rest of his life instructing them all in the secret techniques of money creation and manipulation. As they became of age, he sent them to the major capitals of Europe to open branch offices of the family banking business. Each one went to a major city. Okay? Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. Solomon was sent to Vienna. Nathan went to London. Carl went to Naples. And Yaakov went to Paris. So the family now had a network. In 1838, Nathan made the following statement, very interesting. Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws. And the saga continues, of course, with involvements with Adam Weishaupt, who forms an occult group called the Illuminati. And that leads ultimately to the secret meetings on Jekyll Island, Georgia, which established the Federal Reserve. And that's a path that you can Google and chase down on your own as you go. Now, let's get back to our little theme here. We've used the 7 churches, the 7 epistles of the Lord Jesus Christ. Have you ever wondered why in the book of Revelation it has 7 letters to 7 churches? Why those particular 7? Only 1 or 2 you've heard of before. Most of them you've never heard of before, unless you've, where's the Church of Jerusalem? Where's the church in Antioch? Ephesus? Sure, you got these other weird ones. Why those 7? We also notice in those 7 epistles by the Lord, there is a closing phrase. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. It becomes sort of a tie-off of each of the 7 letters, right? Okay. We discover by examining those letters carefully, and you won't find this in most commentaries, but I challenge you to check it out. There are at least 4 levels of understanding of those letters. The first, of course, is local. Sir William Ramsay actually went through a lot of research and discovered that those 7 churches literally had existence in those days, and they literally had problems that relate to the language of the letter. So they had a local reality at the time, so don't let me dismiss that. But it turns out there's far more going on here. We discover that they're admonitory. What do I mean by that? Look at that phrase. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, plural. What that implies is that every church is to read each of the letters. They may apply in differing degrees to different churches, but every church was to reach, in some way, each letter is admonitory to every church. And by studying that, you quickly discover that's very valid. It gets better. We discover that it also is personal. We call that, if you want a fancy word, we call it homiletic. What do we mean by that? It says, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit. How many of you in the room have an earlobe? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, we haven't missed anybody. Those letters are written to you. He that hath an ear, let him hear. What's the Spirit? So we know there's a homiletic person. So those are 3 levels right there. Each one's quite different. There's a 4th level that's even more astonishing than the first 3. And that's the prophetic. We discover by examining the letters carefully, they lay out the spiritual history of the church in advance for the next 2,000 years. Really? Let's take a look at this. We discover that each letter has 7 elements. There's the name of the church, and it turns out to be relevant to its main message. The title that Jesus uses of himself is different in each one, and it's tailored to the meaning of the letters in a special way. Really? Yeah. Each letter has a commendation. This or that you've done well. Good for you. There's also a concern. This or that you're not doing very well. So some good news and some bad news, right? And because of that, there's, of course, an exhortation. Therefore, I suggest you do this, 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 this. You with me? Then there's a promise to the overcomer in each letter. And there's this funny closing phrase. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the church. That's sort of the partitioner. That's the parsing element, if you will. So far, so good. When you study these things carefully, and I won't take the time in the summary, but each of the names of the letters relates to its main theme. Each title that Jesus uses himself relates to that particular theme. In terms of commendation, we discover that they all have commendation, except two of them. There are two letters about which Jesus has no good news. These are report cards for 7 churches, and 2 of them have a lousy report card. Sardis and Laodicea have nothing good said about them. That's a disturbing discovery you need to make by study those letters and come to your own conclusions. Well, there's concerns. Every letter has some, except there's also 2 for which Jesus has no concern. He's pleased with the results. That's true of Smyrna. To them, he says, just hang in there. I know it's tough times. And, of course, Philadelphia comes out marvelously well. I'm going to come back to those 2 with another surprise hidden away in them in a minute. They all, of course, have an exhortation. Every one has something they can improve. Well, and we have this strange closing phrase, but if we study this carefully, I'll show you something I cannot find in any commentary. There may be some I've missed, but the point is, the promise to the overcomer in the first 3 letters is a postscript. The promise is tucked in after the closing phrase. That's kind of weird. If you have the hermeneutic that I have, I believe nothing is accidental in the scripture. I believe that God has a purpose in every detail. And that obsession has served me well. Because I also discover, you see, the last 4 have the promise to the overcomer in the body of the letter. Wow. And we discover some other things. We notice that the 7 letters, 7 churches are in 2 groups, 3 and 4, for some strange reasons. Now, the 7 epistles of Christ. As we lay those out and study them, we discover that they lay out the history of the church in advance. Ephesus describes the apostolic church, the first century environment. Then we get into the persecuted church. Smyrna, which means death, by the way, and the whole letter is all about that. Then what Satan could not accomplish by persecution, he does by marrying them. We have the perverted marriage where the church is married to the world in the 3rd and 4th century. We all know the story. Then you get to the medieval church, it's the longest of all the letters, and we'll come back to that another time. Then we have the denominational church, and the Protestant commentators have a field day with Thyatira because it's so Vatican-oriented. Well, if that's the case, Sardis is the Reformation. And about the Reformation, Jesus says, you have a name only, but you're spiritually dead. Really? We better study that. And there's the Philadelphia, the missionary church. And then the final church, the apostate church, is so apostate that Jesus is not even in the church. He's outside knocking on the door trying to get in. Now we notice that the first 3 have the promises to the overcomer postscripted. Okay, fair enough. But we notice the second group of 4, the promises are in the body of the letter. That caught our attention earlier, but we notice something else as we examine it more carefully. The last 4 include an explicit reference to the second coming of Christ. The first 3 don't, the last 4 do. That's provocative. I think that's deliberate. I think that's meaningful. In fact, we even discover that one of those 4, Thyatira, has an explicit threat that if it doesn't get their act together, they're going to go into the Great Tribulation. Really? That's pretty wild. You want to check that out for yourself. In contrast to that, The church of Philadelphia has an explicit promise that it won't go into the Great Tribulation. It'll be removed from the time, not from the tribulation, from the whole time of the tribulation in advance. Wow. That's pretty strange. And it, by inference, would include the first three, which are historical. That leaves two that are problematic, and that's Sardis and Laodicea. And I'll leave you with that to study and come to your own conclusions. But why have I bothered to get into this here? Because there is a peculiar allusion that Jesus makes to the church, to the letter to the church at Smyrna. The two churches that have nothing bad said about them also have a peculiar insight included. In Smyrna, Jesus says in verse 9 of chapter 2, I know thy works in tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. What on earth is that all about? This is to a church that's getting basically good marks. It's a good report card. See, you think you're poor, but no, you're much better off than you think you are. But then he adds this peculiar comment, Jesus does. This is Jesus talking here. I know the blasphemy of them who say they are Jews and are not. That's confusing enough. But then he adds this other phrase, but are the synagogue of Satan? And this isn't the only, he mentions this again in a minute, I'll show you. It's mentioned twice. Because if we go down here and take a look at the church at Philadelphia, it's the other of the seven about which there's nothing bad said. Smyrna enjoys that distinction. So does Philadelphia. And when you look at not 2:9, but 3:9, Revelation 3:9, it says, behold, Jesus again, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them come and worship before thy feet, to know that I have loved thee. What on earth is going on here? And I don't know. You see, I'm leaving that for you to do your own study and come to your own conclusions. What are the alternatives? What does he mean by the synagogue of Satan? That's quite a label for the Lord Jesus to use. Who are they? They say they are Jews, but do lie. I find it hard to deny that must at least in some sense include the Edomites, who pretended for various historical reasons to be Jewish, but they're really not. They were the Olam Ibad, the everlasting hatred with Israel. Are they the victims of replacement theology? There are a lot of Christians that have been mistaught by their churches that the church has replaced Israel. That's a lie out of the pit of hell. People who take that view are calling God a liar. In the hundreds of promises in the Old Testament that God promises to Israel suddenly evaporate, you got to be kidding. And those promises occur in the New Testament too. So much so that Paul takes 3 chapters in his definitive statement called the book of Romans, the gospel, chapter 9, 10, and 11. Paul dedicates to the past, the present, and the future of Israel. To hold those views that are taught in most churches is blasphemy. We need to understand that. There are plenty of places where we can have differences of view in the body and shouldn't be a diversion of fellowship, of course. But there are certain things that are disastrous, and that's one of them. It goes hand in hand with amillennialism. To deny the kingdom that we pray for in the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come. What are we praying for? Most people don't know. That's another whole study. Are they victim replacement, or is there something more interior to this phrase? I don't know. I strongly suspect there's far more here that will yield careful study. So I've deliberately included this segment in our series because I think it's part of our perspective of understanding our Messiah, trying to understand his buying habits. You know, it's always interesting when you're in a new organization, there's a new boss, everybody wants to try to know, okay, what are his preferences? What does he like, what he doesn't like? And we should be doing that about Jesus Christ. He's not a concept. He's not a tradition that's useful for some social purposes. No, he's alive and yearning to take over. He's not on his throne. He's on his Father's throne at the moment. The Father is apparently pretty close to saying, go get him. And he's anxious to have us with him. But he's alive and real and with his ambition. We need to understand what he likes and doesn't like. And apparently, there's two things that he mentions of the 7 letters, the 2 favorite ones, the 2 most favorable ones, are Smyrna and Philadelphia. And in both those letters, he makes this peculiar remark of something that he hates. Those that say they are Jews and are not. See, the other thing we've got to learn is Jesus is Jewish. We need to understand that. Did you know that in the millennium, the temple will not be open on Sunday? That shocks many Christians. I'm not saying you can't worship on Sunday, don't misunderstand me, but in the millennium you won't. Because we know from Ezekiel chapter 45, verse 1, the temple will be open on Shabbat and the new moons. Period. Jesus is Jewish. Why do the rabbis call the globalists Edomites? Are they applying this metaphor more broadly than we would at first admit to? So I'm going to leave that as an assignment to you, just tucked it in with these other things we're going to look at today. So let's close with a word of prayer.